Hey everybody, welcome to Hop and Brew School. My name is Spencer Tolkemeyer. I'm the Director of North American Sales for Yakima Chief Hops, and I'm pleased to welcome you today to our Hop and Brew School session about designing efficient beers. I'm joined by a panel of experts here. These are all colleagues of mine that work for Yakima Chief Hops, all of whom are former brewers and have a lot of expertise in the area of recipe retrofitting, using advanced products, and all sorts of other brewing related topics. I'm joined on my right here by Michael Visgel, who's our RSM for the Oregon and Northern California region. Andy Arsenault is our Key Accounts Division Lead, and I'm joined virtually by one of our colleagues across the United States here, Josh Wurzbacher, who is our Mid-Atlantic Regional Sales Manager. And then all the way across the pond, he's at happy hour time right now, so you might see him drinking a beer while we're drinking coffee here in the Pacific Northwest. But Richie Hodges is located in Europe, and he is our Regional Sales Manager for Germany, Austria, and Switzerland. So welcome, guys. Thanks for coming on here. We're here today to talk about designing efficient beers, which is, I think, not the most attractive sounding topic on the surface, because what we're all mostly trying to do is make the most flavorful beers possible. But really what this presentation is intended to be is a way to talk about that it's a given that we all want to make the best and most flavorful beers possible. How do we also make those beers efficient, cost effective? How do we make them make money for breweries? That's ultimately something that's going to help the brewery's bottom line and help you continue to make quality beer well into the future. So this presentation is intended to be very practical. It should bear a lot of takeaways for those of you out in the market who are looking to retrofit recipes to make them a little more efficient for your brewery. So with that, we'll get right into it. A quick introduction for those that don't know us. We are Yakima Chief Hops. Our mission is very simple, and that's connecting family farms with the world's finest brewers, which is, of course, all of you. We are owned by 14 family farms here in the Pacific Northwest, spread throughout Washington, Oregon, and Idaho. The 14 families that own our company are represented here on the slide. And we also procure hops from an additional something like 37 families throughout the year. Our harvest season just began about 4 days ago. So we are actively picking hops right now. The valley has become very aromatic, and we're very pleased to be entering another harvest season here. We are also a part of a breeding company called Yakima Chief Ranches, formerly known as Select Botanicals Group. This company is not only responsible for bringing hops to market from original pollen cross to eventual market commercialization. They're also responsible for farm quality management programs that assure that the Simcoe Citra mosaic that you've come to know and love is indeed Simcoe Citra mosaic every time that you use it. And over the years, they've been responsible for bringing a number of iconic varieties to market, beginning in 1997 with a Tannum, all the way through up to today with some heavy hitters that you probably recognize, such as Simcoe, Citra, Mosaic, Equinaut, Laurel, Sabro, and Pato, and most recently Talus last year, which was released in November, which is a daughter of Sabro and a very quickly growing variety in our portfolio here. So with that, it's a little introduction on who we are and where we come from. I'd like to get into the nitty-gritty of some recipes here. And the way that we're actually going to talk about efficient recipes is by actually sort of digging into recipes themselves and looking at ways that we might actually retrofit existing recipes. So we'll do 2 test cases today. The first one is a West Coast IPA. So this IPA is an all T90 recipe as it exists right now. So you see it on screen here. Rather standard, pretty typical grist. All T90 is about 61 IBUs. This recipe is pretty aggressively hopped at about 19.7 grams per liter, which is roughly speaking maybe 5 pounds per barrel. So an aggressively hopped IPA, but really not that atypical for the way that people are producing beers these days. So something that we would pretty typically see in the market, 2 dry hop additions, a hefty whirlpool addition, and a bittering charge at 60 minutes. So when we're thinking about how to make a recipe like this more efficient, typically when we're talking about efficiency, we're talking about yield. We're talking about flavor quality and being able to deliver that on a more efficient basis. And really, it kind of comes down to being able to achieve the same flavor while being able to either achieve more yield in either the kettle or the cellar, and hopefully ultimately achieve more net return for the brewery so that you're able to continue to make awesome beer. So when I'm looking at a recipe like this, the first thing that I might identify is what can we do to make the bittering charge more efficient. I think that's one of the easiest ways that a brewer can sort of make their recipe more efficient. Typically the way that we would do that is by identifying a bittering charge and looking at a potential extract addition potentially. So before we do that though, I want to get into just really quickly about what T90 pellets are. This is an all T90 recipe as it exists right now. A lot of people don't think too much about T90 pellets, right? It's what the industry standard is. It's what everybody uses. Almost everybody's familiar with using T90 pellets. But there's a great diversity of T90 pellet quality out in the market, and I think this is something that every brewer should think about when they are designing recipes, is what makes a quality T90 pellet and what types of questions should you be asking of a vendor to assure that you're getting a quality pellet. So this is what you see on screen is Yakima Chief's T90 pellet specifications. These are all intended to optimize the highest utilization of oil and alpha acid, right? So what we always say about the pelleting process is we can't make a hop better in pelleting, but we sure can screw it up if we do it poorly, right? So what we're intending to do there is take what the farm is given us in a bale format and preserve it in as high a quality format as we possibly can. So what you see on screen are things that have been engineered to help a craft brewer make the best beer possible. From pellet temperature at die, which is among the lowest in the industry, we use large amounts of liquid nitrogen to make sure that our pellet temperatures are very cold, so that minimal amounts of rupture and damage are occurring to lupulin glands. Our pellet density is very low, which results in a very fluffy, easy to dissolve pellet, and that's because we quite simply see that the majority of our brewers at this point are using large amounts of hops on the cold side, and they need the hops to be able to disperse easily in a cold liquid. And many of you who have been brewing for a long time will remember the days of a vacuum-packed hop mylar foil. We don't do that anymore. We use a nitrogen flush soft pack these days. That's also because we want it to be easy on the brewer. We want the hops to be able to be flowable and pour easily into the top of a fermenter. But beyond that, we feel that nitrogen flushing is a superior way to package hops. Our standard for residual O2 content in package is less than 2%, but in most cases it ends up being less than 1%, which means that our hops are minimally degrading over the course of multiple years past harvest, which is one of the reasons that we encourage people to not feel afraid even of using previous crop year product. So all in all, I don't want to spend too much time on T90 pellets, but you should think about what a T90 pellet is, and you should ask questions of any vendor that you're buying hops from about what are their T90 pellet specifications and what are they doing to assure that they're the highest quality possible. So arriving back at our recipe here, one thing that we can do to make this more efficient is to reduce the amount of T90 pellet material that we're actually putting in the beer, because typically the sponge effect of T90 pellet material is going to be one of the primary sources of yield loss in a beer. So in this particular recipe, what I'm going to pay attention to first off is just that bittering addition of Pato. So it's not a huge addition, 2.2 kgs and 30 hectoliters in this case. That's delivering 25 IBU. But it's a really easy thing to replace that 2.2 kgs to reduce any of that hop material that's going to end up in the bottom of the kettle or whirlpool at the end of the batch. So, so to look at our product matrix here, we've got fresh hops that eventually become whole leaf hops, T90 pellet hops, and what can be eventually produced from that is CO2 extract. And I think a lot of brewers are kind of scared of CO2 extract. Back in the day, a long time ago, extract was made from hexane extraction, things like that. Brewers should not feel afraid of CO2 extract. The way that it's produced these days is extremely high quality. It's being done with supercritical CO2. That is the solvent. There are no additional solvents or mechanical changes that are happening chemical changes that are happening in the CO2 extract process. What we're looking at is a mechanical separation of sort of the guts of the hop and removing all of the solids and leaf material. So what that looks like from a composition standpoint is what you see on the screen here are two sort of pie charts that show hop extract composition versus whole leaf or pellet composition. And so everything that you see in blue is what we would just basically consider hop solids. So it's cellulose, water, ash, lipids, things like that. polyphenols. Those are all going to be removed from the CO2 extract process. And what's left is all the stuff in red, which is what we would sort of call like the flavor and bitter active compounds in hops, right? So those are being concentrated, and they're being extracted into an aqueous or liquid format. And it's all being done via just very, very high pressure supercritical CO2. Happens on site here at Yakima Chief Hops. We do all our own CO2 extraction. There are some tremendous advantages to CO2 extract. So one of the first things that's just really advantageous about it is you're working with a quarter of the mass. So there's a tremendous dosing efficiency. So it's a liquid format that you're dosing into the kettle. There's no trube formation via the hops at that point. The only trube that you're going to experience at that point is just from whatever malt proteins and things like that that are precipitating during your boil. So you're reducing wort loss pretty heavily if you're using CO2 extract in the kettle or potentially in the whirlpool. It can also reduce brew kettle foam formation during the boil and reduce the vegetal and polyphenol flavor contribution. So you're helping reduce kettle foam, you're helping reduce some of the harsher and more vegetal elements of some of the leaf material that can translate into hops. There's also a really significant advantage when it comes to shipping, storage, and handling. Because it is only a quarter of the mass of T90 pellets, you're literally just shipping way less weight, so freight costs are lower. There's a better product stability over time. CO2 extract is a very, very stable product. It has a great shelf stability. You can store it for many years without worrying about degradation. Additionally, it does not require cold storage, which is a tremendous advantage for people who are short on cold storage, which based on my experience is pretty much every brewery in the world. So ambient storage can be an awesome thing. It does reduce the shelf life from 5 years at cold temperatures to 3 years at ambient, but 3 years is still a pretty long time to be able to store stuff at an ambient temperature without worrying about degradation. So from a sustainability perspective too, there's an advantage there. We're essentially not shipping you a lot of leaf material. We are just shipping you sort of the flavor and bitter active components of the hops. So you're able to save on freight, save on wort loss, and save on cold storage, which is some pretty tremendous advantages. So some tips for using CO2 extract. It is a liquid, it's a very viscous liquid, and it comes in a tin. So what we recommend is that you need to be mindful of how to dose a liquid that is very viscous into your wort stream. So this is a hot side only product. This is something that I'd really just like to kind of get into brewers' minds right off the bat, is that we don't recommend using this product on the cold side. People have tried before, some have maybe been successful. It's just typically not a good idea, and it results in a very messy cleanup in the fermenter because it is such a viscous product. So use it in the kettle. Typically this is going to be dosed in the kettle via pouring, or via potentially some perforations in the tin and dropping it into the kettle. Some people use a basket or a string to dip it down into the kettle and let it just kind of, the wort bubbling actually kind of dissolve the extract itself. Pretty easy to dose in the kettle and pretty trouble-free. In the whirlpool it can be dosed, and it can be very, very effective actually, but it needs to be done with some care. Because the whirlpool does not have the benefit of agitation via the boiling, there does need to be some care taken when you're doing that. So if you are going to do it in the whirlpool, we recommend that there be some small amount of either dilution, definitely some heating ahead of time. So we recommend that you would heat the tin before use. So that you could either take the tin, soak it in some hot water, potentially put it on the top of your kettle and let it heat up during the lauter process. But do something that allows the tin to heat up to reduce the viscosity of the liquid. And then typically we would also recommend, if you're going to use it in a non-agitated situation like a whirlpool, to dilute it slightly before use. So if you have like a stainless steel bucket, you could pour it into the bucket and use some wort or some hot water to potentially stir it up and actually achieve a small dilution. And then from there, really what you're going to want to do is just take care to fully incorporate it. Don't just dump it straight in. As you're whirlpooling, give it a slow pour and make sure that you're allowing it to become fully incorporated into the liquid, and not just become a big glob of liquid that's going to stick to either the bottom of your kettle or whirlpool or the walls. We'd like to basically just make sure that the liquid is being as fully incorporated as possible, and in a heated situation that's generally not tremendously difficult as long as you take care when you're dosing. So that's a little bit of a primer on CO2 extract, but just arriving back at our recipe, 25 IBUs is what we were achieving with those 2.2 kgs of hops. We are now achieving that same amount of bitterness via one 300 GMA tin. 300 GMAs is a pretty standard tin size for us, so we have it in multiple varieties. But what you've eliminated there, as you can see at the bottom, we've taken what was a recipe for 30 hectoliters that had 59.2 kgs of hops in it, and we've now taken that down to 57. So 2.2 kgs removed may not seem like a lot, but as bittering additions are larger, different recipes, that can make a pretty significant impact in a beer. And ultimately what we're trying to do here is make small incremental changes to a recipe that doesn't change the flavor profile, but allows us to continue to reduce the amount of wort loss that we're experiencing in a brew house situation. So I don't think we want to stop there though with this recipe. We have a lot of other hop additions that we could potentially make more efficient here. So we've removed the bittering addition and replaced it with CO2 extract. What I'd like to look at now is some of these dry hop additions that we have here. So a whirlpool addition, which is a pretty hefty whirlpool addition of 6 kgs of Simcoe, and one each of the dry hop additions. And we're going to take a look at potentially replacing those with cryo. So what we have here is our product matrix once again. Fresh hops go to whole leaf hops, go to pellets and CO2 extract. But one other product stream that we have that results not from pellets, but actually from whole leaf hops is a completely different product stream, which is cryo hop production. So cryo hops are produced in a completely separate plant. They're in a standalone plant here in Yakima. And the cryo process is very simply a mechanical, extremely cold, extremely high integrity separation of the whole cone into two constituent parts, which is the leaf material or bract and the lupulin-rich material which eventually becomes a cryo pellet. For anybody who would like to have like a deeper dive on cryo and what it is and how it's made, that we have other Hop and Brew School webinars that have covered that in detail. I won't get into that too much today, but I'd like to really speak about the practical applications of cryo. So the main benefit of cryo, of course, is just that you're adding so much less physical material to your beer while adding the same amount of lupulin and so alpha and oil essentially. So basically, we're taking the whole cone and we're concentrating it, and what we end up with something that's about 45% by weight of the original hop cone. And what we have left in the pellet is a highly enriched form of lupulin, which is alpha, beta, and essential oil. So speaking in very plain terms, if you were using 10 pounds of Citra T90 in your recipe before, you can use 5 pounds of Citra Cryo and achieve approximately the equivalent flavor active and alpha active dose. That ratio does vary a little bit depending on recipe, but that's what we tend to recommend. So to put a fine point on that, we have a little kind of demonstration here on screen that shows the potential just applications of how that can save you money in a cellar situation. So primarily we're interested here in the 2 glasses on the right, 10 grams T90 pellets and 5 grams cryo hops pellets. So it's important to understand that even though we're talking about literally half the mass here, we're talking about the equivalent sort of RHE dose or raw hop equivalent dose. So so we have the equivalent amount of pellets in each of these glasses. And then on this next screen here, what we see is the same glasses after they've been filled with room temperature water and allowed to sit for 90 minutes. So these have not been agitated at this point. What you can see in the 2 glasses on the right is the beginnings of what we would see like in a trube formation situation in a fermenter. You can already start to see that the cryo hops glass, even though they contain, like I said, the same, roughly speaking, amount of alpha and beta and essential oil, the trube load that's showing up in the bottom of the glass is significantly diminished when compared with the T90 pellet glass. That's made more apparent here in the same glasses after they've been agitated and then allowed to sit for 30 minutes again. It's a little bit hard to see, but you can really, if you look hard at the screen, see that the T90 pellet glass has approximately 3 times as much trube settling at the bottom of the glass than the cryo hops glass. So obviously glassware is not the same as a fermenter, but you can begin to see some of the applications of how this could affect cellar yields in particular as people are loading up large dry hop additions. Simply by adding so much less mass to your fermenter, you're tremendously reducing the sponge effect of large dry hop additions in the cellar. So what we typically tend to see is that the average change in beer yield by replacing T90 pellets with cryo is roughly speaking about 3 to 5%. What we find is also that in today's more heavily hopped beers, so particularly in New England IPAs and double IPAs and things like that, that ends up looking in a lot of cases more like 5 to 7%. So what does that look like on a dollars basis? This is kind of a revenue estimation here based on some pretty modest calculations. So this is assuming that a person is grossing about $400 per hectoliter, and at a 1 kg per hectoliter, or sorry, what is that? Yeah, so 1 kg per hectoliter. The dosing rate, if a person is replacing 1 kg per hec with cryo hops, they are if they were to yield 2% additional volume from that batch, which is relatively modest. That's actually lower than what we would expect. That the person would net $59 on that batch by the end of production. When we look at a more typical yield increase, which is 5%, the same batch, which is a 30 hectoliter batch, would yield an additional 1.5 hectoliters, which is, based on this revenue calculation, $419 per batch. So even with the additional cost increase of cryo, which there is some cost increase based on our processing costs and having to use large amounts of liquid nitrogen to make the product, it's very easy to see very quickly how cryo can potentially increase the net revenues per batch for a brewery. So going back to our own recipe here, what we've done is actually replace one of the Whirlpool editions, the first dry hop edition, and one of the second dry hop editions with cryo. And what that means is that we've been able to cut the effective dosing rate of each of cut the practical dosing rate of each of those additions in half. The effective dosing rate is the same. So we're not reducing the amount of flavor active material that's going into the beer. What we're doing is just simply reducing the amount of material that's going into the beer. So when compared to our original T90 recipe, which had 59.2 kgs going into the recipe from brew house to final yield, we now have a dosing rate of 42.4 kgs of material, which is 14.1 grams per liter. The effective dosing rate between these two things is the same, but what we've done is reduced practically a large amount of the physical material that's going into the beer that has the potential to sort of sponge up wort and ultimately result in loss of efficiency and yield loss for the brewer. So this is a pretty quick and dirty way to look at a recipe. But what I, as a brewer, tend to think about is what is something that's a low-hanging fruit that I can replace with another product type to make my beer equally as flavorful, potentially even more flavorful, but at a more efficient dosing rate. So cryo and CO2 extract are the two easiest ways to go about that, and that's what we typically recommend to people. We'll very briefly here, though, take a look at another test case recipe. In this case, what we're looking at is an Imperial IPA. Once again, pretty standard, very pale, heavy grist. This is a pretty bitter beer, 67 IBUs. Once again, a very aggressive dosing rate from an aromatic perspective. Two very heavy Whirlpool additions, some rather large dry hop additions, particularly a 3 variety second dry hop addition, which has quite a bit of material in it. So 57.7 kgs per 30 hectoliter batch going into this recipe. So a rather hefty dosing rate, wanting to look at how we could potentially make that more efficient. So once again, one of the easiest things for us to do here is to look at the bittering addition and how can we potentially replace that. In this case, we're using Warrior T90 pellets, 3.7 kgs of that to achieve 31 IBUs. So the way that we'll replace that is by actually just using, it's quite a simple calculation. This is a tool that's available on the Yakima Chief website. That's located in the Brewing Tools section. But basically what we're doing here is using a substitution of T90s for extract and calculating what we're going to need to get to achieve 31 IBUs. So in this case, we see that 450 GMA is going to achieve 31 IBUs for us in a 30 hectoliter batch. Because of the higher gravity of this batch, the kettle efficiency actually goes a little bit down, which is the reason we have to use a little bit higher GMAs to get our 31 IBUs. But 450 GMA, that's either one 300 GMA tin and one 150 GMA tin, or three 150 GMA tins, however you'd like to do it. But it breaks down very nicely. One question that we do get from brewers sometimes is, if I'm trying to dose, let's say it's 40 IBUs, and 450 GMAs gets me 31 IBUs, should I try to use 3 1/4 tins or 3 1/2 tins? And what I typically recommend to people is, it's not impossible to split a tin or to dose a partial tin into a batch. It is rather difficult though, and it's not the easiest thing for a brewer to do. So typically what I would recommend is use whole tin increments. So in this case, if it was 40 IBUs and our 450 GMA tins only achieved us 31 IBUs, I would recommend that you get the last 9 IBUs out of a T90 pellet edition. So you're still achieving a large amount of efficiency gain by getting most of your bittering from extract, but those last few IBUs, you're getting it from T90 pellets. It's easier to do that than trying to split a tin. Splitting a tin is a little bit difficult. It's not impossible. There are calculations on our website if you'd like to try to do that, and if you feel like it's more efficient. I would just recommend that you do heat the tin before you're doing it to make it a little more flowable, and that you pay really specific attention to your dosing rates. Going back to our recipe here, though, we've removed.
Hey, Spencer, I had a quick question.
Oh, sorry, we have a question coming in. I should have explained that earlier. The question is, what does GMA stand for? Which is a great question. That's grams of alpha acid. So one of the things to understand about CO2 extract is it's sold on a GMA basis, which means that you're looking at an apples to apples dosing rate between varieties, which is nice. So 150 GMAs of Warrior is the same as 150 GMAs of Pato, as 150 GMAs of Columbus. The variety that went into it is different. Potentially the alpha acid of the variety that went into it is different, but the amount of alpha acid and bittering potential in that tin is standardized between those varieties. So in a certain sense, I'm not going to say that variety doesn't matter. I think the quality of bitterness can be different between varieties, but the pure amount of alpha acid available in that tin is going to be standardized between varieties. So grams of alpha acid is the same within each tin, which allows for really easy dosing for brewers at that point. So it's a great question, though. Thanks for asking that. Looking back at our recipe, we've removed 3.7 kgs here. So we've taken our recipe that was 57.7 kgs of material and taken that down to 54. In this case, I'm going to think about how we could potentially, though, even make this kettle side recipe or the hot side recipe more efficient. And we're actually going to look at removing all T90 pellets from the kettle in this case. Kettle and whirlpool. So we're actually going to take this Mosaic and Simcoe T90 edition, both of them 6 kgs each in this recipe, and we're going to replace those with extract. So this is a little different than dosing for bitterness. We're actually going to be dosing for aromatics at this point. And the typical rule of thumb that we're going to use in this situation is that 150 GMAs for most varieties is going to equal approximately 1 kg of aroma hops. It is a little different between varieties, so I would recommend that if you're retrofitting a recipe and you have questions on this, that you actually reach out to your Yakima chief representative so that we can kind of talk through it on a varietal basis. But roughly speaking, most varieties are 150 GMAs typically equals 1 kg of aroma hops. So since we make extract of Mosaic, Simcoe, Cascade, Warrior, Pato, Equinox, so on and so forth, we have varietal specific extract. It is possible to dose CO2 extract for aromatics, because all of the essential oils, alpha, beta, and the sort of the flavor and aroma active fractions of the hop are retained in CO2 extract. So in the case of our recipe here, we're replacing 6 kgs of Simcoe T90 with Simcoe CO2 extract. So based on our rough calculation that we're talking about here, 6 kgs of Simcoe equals 900 GMAs of Simcoe CO2 extract. So in that case, probably what I would recommend for the brewer is 300 GMA tins would be an effective replacement for the 6 kgs of Simcoe. So once again, I'll just advocate a second time, not to sound like a broken record. If you're going to dose CO2 extract in the whirlpool, it's a very effective way to add aroma, but you do need to take care when you're doing it. Make sure that you heat the tin before you use it, and ideally you would actually add some sort of dilution into pre-dilution prior to adding to a kettle or whirlpool situation to allow you to have a less viscous material that you're adding to the wort itself. So take care to fully incorporate it, dilute it with water or wort, and pour slowly. It is also worthy to note that the tin that we produce and the ink that's printed on the tin is food safe. So if there's a scenario in which you're able to just actually dose the entire tin into the liquid itself, that is perfectly food safe and acceptable. So you're able to do that too. So once again, if you're interested in kind of like looking at your specific brew house situation and kind of honing in on the best place to dose, I would encourage you to reach out to our staff, because we would be able to make much more specific recommendations at that point. But in general, I would say just take care to make sure that you're fully incorporating. So arriving back at our recipe here, we've replaced each of those Whirlpool editions with 3 300 GMA tins each. And we've effectively eliminated an additional 12 kgs of physical material from our recipe here. So what we've done is completely eliminate any hop solids whatsoever from the hot side of this recipe, which is amazing, right? So we have literally no hop solids going into the beer. We're delivering the same amount of alpha and aroma that we had previously. And what it's allowing us to do is have the only trub formation at that point that should be happening is malt-based trub formation. So it should allow our brewer to capture a very, very substantial amount of wort that would normally be lost in sort of the sponge effect of the whirlpool or the kettle. So we've taken down our effective dosing rate. Our effective dosing rate is the same, but we've taken down our practical dosing rate from 57.7 kgs of hops in a 30 hectoliter batch to 42 kgs. So that's a really quick and dirty way of looking at recipe reformulation. It's something that we do every day. All of the people that you see on this panel are former brewers, and so we're here to help with any questions that come up. So if you have a recipe that you're looking at, it's making great beer, but it's just killing your yields, it's killing your cost, let's take a look at it together. Let's look at how we might be able to pick out some low-hanging fruit that allows you to make more efficient beer, and ultimately allow you to hopefully make more money and keep your consumers very, very happy at the same time. So thank you for joining us. We also have a brewing help desk that is staffed by former brewers as well. So that's brewinghelp@yakimachief.com. If you ever have any troubleshooting questions or recipe design questions, anything that we can help you with, we encourage you to reach out to that help desk at any time. And with that, we'll begin chatting with our panel here. As I mentioned, all of the guys that are on panel today have brewed extensively in the past, have used all of these various products. So I guess I'll just open it up to you guys. Based on your experience, guys, any anecdotes or sort of personal success stories that you guys would like to share based on your personal brewing experience with extract, cryo, or any other products that have made beers more efficient for you over time?
I would say that from just using an extract perspective from an extract perspective in terms of generating flavor, I think there's, you touched on it earlier, Spencer, where, the apprehension to get into extract. And I think what's really important here is that over time there's been a philosophical shift of how we use products in different ways. And what's really important is that you don't necessarily have one product that's going to cure all of your troubles or what you might be looking for, and adding a different type of complexity. So it's as much as it is about efficiency as it relates to something like extract that I have a lot of experience in. It's really about having the ability to utilize multiple tools in conjunction with each other. And I think that as folks are looking at heavy hop doses in the whirlpool, in some cases 3 or 4 pounds per barrel in the whirlpool, being able to cut that effectively and still get very, very solid flavor through it without maybe necessarily complicating your heat exchanger situation is something that's super attractive. But even with extract, in my experience, in terms of making sure that it is solubilized in an effective way, making sure that, depending on how your system is set up, even pre-dosing it, you mentioned with a little bit of, maybe hot wort or water into a whirlpool and then chasing it with that beer to ensure a really good mix. because I think in some cases, if you do 100% replacement, it is important to consider trube tightening, and maybe that adding a little bit of pellets on that side would be super helpful. But I think that extract from a flavor perspective is here to stay and something that's growing in terms of receptiveness.
Yeah, it's a good point, and I think we get that question from time to time, which is like, do you guys see a future in which T90 pellets won't exist? And my answer to that is like, no, or at least not in the near future. I think that these are all intended to just be tools in your toolbox, right? They're things that you should feel comfortable and ready to utilize as it suits the recipe, right? So ultimately, like you said, some people to get a tighter trube cone and stuff like that, they may be able to reduce the bulk of what's going into their hot side additions by using CO2 extract, but could potentially utilize a little bit of T90 to kind of help with the trube tightening and things like that. And so the recipe will sort of dictate what is appropriate to use, but these should be tools in a brewer's toolbox that they feel ready and able to use as the recipe, as it suits the recipe. So. Josh, how about you? You had a long history of brewing on some rather large systems at yards, and so you've probably utilized quite a few things like this.
Yeah, first I'd like to say that efficiency in beer is a lifelong pursuit, and you'll never find the perfect answer. You should always be looking for the next best thing. But one situation we ran into was overloading our whirlpool with hops. So we'd use T90s in the kettle for bittering, and then we'd do a big whirlpool charge. And we were overloading our screens and losing a ton of efficiency that way. So we ended up switching to CO2 extract, which was a very easy process. It allowed us to get more hops into the whirlpool and save a bunch of barrels in efficiency. But even then, we were making beers where the whirlpool load was still way too large. So we ended up switching to cryo for a few beers to help save some efficiency. And the return into the tank was way higher following that pattern. But even, there's still a ton of stuff you can do downstream to help improve your efficiency.
Yeah, it's a good point too, and one that we haven't talked about yet, which is also just reducing strain on your infrastructure, right? So by reducing kettle and cellar loads, you're reducing strain on your heat exchanger, you're reducing strain on your wastewater supply. So like by eliminating a large amount of, a heavy amount of the solids that you're putting down your wastewater, I think municipalities are becoming more and more strict on what people put down drains as time goes on. So there's an advantage there too of just kind of reducing the strain on all your utilities and your brew house, your various pieces of equipment. So I think that's not to be diminished either. But Andy, you've brewed on all sizes of systems, from huge systems of Victory to a smaller brewery that you owned yourself, and I think even in a small brewery situation, I think we have brewers that feel intimidated to use some of these more complex products on a small scale, or like those are just for the big guys, right? And how do I use those on the small scale? But you've definitely proven that wrong on a very small scale previously.
Yeah, so I was skeptic of using CO2 extract on a smaller scale until we had we're making a West Coast IPA that we were hopping it very high, like a New England hazy IPA, and it was just a little too grassy, a little too green. So what we did, we just took out all the Whirlpool T90 hops, which is about 11 pounds, and we added in a can of Simcoe 150 GMA and Mosaic 150 GMA, which is a little lower than what we recommended. And we took the cans, when Spencer was talking about hot water, we just took our hot liquor tank, whatever the strike water was, put in a bucket, soaked the cans for like 30 minutes, and we added the extract at the 2-minute mark. And it went right in beautifully, and the beer turned out even better than we expected. So after that, we started incorporating CO2 extract at 2 minutes, and then even at 0 minutes, and then even at the Whirlpool as well. And we saw that reduced veggie, like green character, and yeah, the beer was even more expressive than we anticipated. So it was a good win for us. And the other thing I wanted to add was, if you guys wanted to see what varieties we carry, you can go on our webpage, our website, and we had a nice description of the varieties and the alpha range as well, in case you're interested in that. And our calculators are online as well.
What size of brew house was that?
It was a 10-barrel brew
10 barrel?
house. Sorry. Yep.
So I think we see people using extract in breweries as small as 5-barrel even. So it's definitely not something that a small brewer needs to feel tremendously intimidated by using, or like it's only for the big guys. There's great success stories, particularly the way people are brewing beer these days. you know, it's the yield losses can be rough on New England IPAs. So anything you can do to kind of help extract a little more wort out of your batch process would be great. So I'll also mention we're going to pop over to Richie here, but before I do, if you have any questions, we are planning on spending some time in Q&A here, so please put those in the chat function so that we're able to see those questions and answer that here. We definitely have a lot of expertise on screen here, so if you have any questions that you'd like us to answer in just a few moments here, please send those through. But Richie, what do you see over in Europe? I mean, you know, you guys deal with different challenges over there. You know, cold storage is, I think, is much more expensive over there. Brew houses tend to be, you know, square footage in older cities and things like that tends to be at a premium. Brew houses have to be smaller and more creative, and you know, you got to be pretty ingenious to make beer over there, especially in some of these cities which are extremely expensive to live in. So what do you see people doing over there to kind of make their beers more efficient and help them kind of make that viable?
I will start by saying, since the majority of my business is done in Germany, it's definitely German efficiency is definitely a thing. And so when you come with a product like cryo, I think it really speaks to the brewers that have dealt with for years now, trying to produce the best beers possible, but also trying to produce beers as efficient as possible. And there's a lot of hurdles. And I think what we do when we look at cryo, and I talk with a lot of these brewers, is they see very quickly that some of the, especially with the new beer styles that maybe they traditionally weren't brewing that they want to get into, we're talking about hazies or double drafts, where the hopping rates are quite high. They're really not financially a viable option for them. And still we start looking at the numbers of cryo, where actually the output that they're going to be able to get without overwhelming their, starting, as you said, in whirlpool and going into the wort chiller, not overwhelming that, no doubt overwhelming the whirlpool. But then when we get on the other side of things as well with dry hopping, I think that's where they really are very impressed. And I think it's threefold really when we look at it. You're using less of the product, so you're soaking up less of the finished beer at that point. But we're also seeing that it's falling out. It's also very compact, especially in smaller breweries that are often filling direct from small fermenters, whether we're talking small, 20, 30 hecto size. Typically with T90s, you're going to have kind of a very kind of, relaxed settling of the T90 hops, where there's, I won't say air pockets, there's always no air in there, but it's definitely kind of fluffy in the bottom there. Whereas cryo, we're seeing it very compact, very similar to when yeast settles out very compact, which means it needs to be dropped out more often, which is also better for the beer as well to get it out of there. And I think that's very impressive for them. And I think on the third point, what I'm seeing here, and it's exciting for me as well, is it's become also a new knob in the brewery that they can turn on. Since with cryo hops especially, we're really, with the concentration of the specific aromas for a variety, and we're highlighting those, it's another knob that you can turn on, and you want a little bit more cryo, a little less cryo, and combine it with T90, and it just gives a bigger palette to work with, and where you can get very exact with particular aromas, or you can dial it back, and I think that's very exciting for a lot of the brewers that I'm talking to. It just kind of gives them a little bit more, another tool to work with. That's not just about efficiency. It's wonderful in the efficiency aspect, but also as far as aroma spectrum. They're able to dial things in even more exact than they were previously, and I think that's very exciting for them.
Yeah, that's a great point too. I mean, this whole presentation is based upon, efficiency and things like that, but it should be an assumption that we're talking about, efficiency within the same or better flavor spectrum that we were achieving previously, right? We're obviously not going to, as craft brewers, sacrifice beer quality just in the name of efficiency. So it has to produce the same beer or better. And we do find that in the case of cryo, a lot of times, that people feel that the flavor profile that's achieved by switching some of their T90 material to cryo is more clean, it's more straightforward, and it's punchier because you're removing so much of the leaf material that can be a little distracting to the palate. So there's the additional advantage there that's not just efficiency based, but also flavor cleanliness based, that people really appreciate those sort of bright and punchy flavors that cryo can offer them. So looks like we do have a couple of questions that have come through here. Do you know if there is any more or less rupturing of the lupulin glands in T90 processing versus soft pellets versus just cryo powder? Any known impacts of this on the flavor of the different materials? So I'm not sure what soft pellets We don't produce cryo powder. I guess I should clarify that. There was a screen that showed a cryo powder glass. That slide is a little bit old. We actually don't produce cryo powder anymore. The reason being is that we just got really good at pelletizing, and what the feedback that we consistently got from brewers was that the cryo powder was a great product, but it just was very difficult to handle. It tended to float, and it tended to kind of blow up out of the fermenter a little bit. So we don't actually produce a powder anymore. What we're going for in the cryo process is minimal lupulin rupture, right? So that's by freezing the cone to sub-zero and shattering it, it allows us to produce, lupulin that at that temperature is something like sand almost. We can really, very, very actively concentrate the lupulin glands without, with minimal physical damage. Physical damage tends to be the point at which the hop starts to be able to degrade, right? That's when oxygen has more of surface area and other things that it can attach itself to. Oxidation and degradation start to occur at that point. So as much as possible, what we're going for is the maintenance of that sort of membrane around the lupulin gland, minimal rupture and smear. And we find that HSI is not the most perfect measure of hop freshness, but it is one measure that the industry uses, and we find that our HSIs on cryo tend to be the lowest of any product that we produce. And we believe that that's partially because of the vast amount of liquid nitrogen that's going into the processing, which displaces oxygen, but also just strictly because of the mechanical damage that the lupulin gland is experiencing during the process is extremely low. So I hope that answers your question. Guys, I don't know if you have anything you want to add to that, but typically speaking, cryo is, I would say, our highest integrity pellet, maybe the highest integrity pellet in the world, just because of how gently it's handled throughout the process. So.
That's fascinating.
We do have one more question too. Have you used any hop products other than pellets to dry hop non-beer products? So dry hop kombucha, cider, hop waters, or teas, for example. You guys are out in the market and see a lot of different applications all over. Anybody have any particular applications that come to mind when you think about this question?
So I would look at, I guess my question would be, is the desire for efficiency in dry hopping? What would be a dry hopping rate surrounding these types of products, considering they're a little bit unconventional, knowing that you have hop waters or teas, for example, if you were to throw T90s in there or a pellet of some sort that might throw color or haze, what kind of, I guess I would like to know a little bit more surrounding that question. But what I could say is that, there are, depending on what your desired outcome is, there are things that could, say, adjust bitterness. If maybe your mouthfeel in a hop water might be blending towards an IPA impression, you could, back bitter with something like isomerized alpha acid, for instance. There are also products that exist in the market from a hop oil perspective that I've seen applied in these spaces. So I would like to know a little bit more context around it, but there are things that kind of take those efficiencies down that path depending on what the desired outcome is.
Josh, it looks like you maybe had something to add to that too.
Yeah, tomorrow I'll be conducting a presentation on hop water. And while I don't have a lot of experience brewing, and I've talked to a lot of brewers who are doing a lot of R&D with it or have some commercially available products, and they tend to say that the hopping rates stay relatively the same, depending on the kind of style that you're trying to create. But they also take advantage of extracts as well as cryo in all their processes. That'll be tomorrow at 1 p.m. Pacific time.
Yeah, and I can say just from personal experience that some of the people that we work with that are making hop waters and stuff like that are definitely utilizing extract. I definitely am aware of a kombucha maker using cryo in a dry hop kombucha. So, from a dosing perspective and things like that, alcohol is a great solvent in cider and in other alcoholic products, just like it would be for in beer. In water-based products or NA products, hop tea, stuff like that, I think solubility goes down a little bit, but the principles should still apply in terms of efficiency and being able to achieve the most flavor with the minimal loss. So I feel like very confident that you could dose cryo in any format that you were going to be dosing T90 pellets in. And extract obviously requires a little more care. It would need to be a heated process at that point, but I do feel like it could be dosed effectively if there's an application out there that calls for something on a hot side situation. So it's good questions though. I do encourage if there are any more questions that you go ahead and add them to the chat there. Richie, I think you had something to say there?
Just a quick question for the panel, actually, from my side, as we were talking about extracts, which we have quite a bit of conversation with brewers here, which might be interesting for everybody. But you mentioned earlier when we looked at the Imperial IPA, talking about, which is a typical situation we're all familiar with, especially with high gravity brewing or brewing stronger beers, that we typically lower the efficiency of using T90 on the bittering side. If we are looking at going to an extract to replace that, do we still need to look at high gravity as a lower efficiency, or how does that affect the end IBU in a beer compared to a T90?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's built in, depending on what bittering, I mean, this is my answer to it, and I'd be interested to see what you guys say. Depending on what bittering equation you use, you know, there's like Tinseth, Rager, there's a few different bittering sort of like equations out there to calculate IBUs. I think all of them have a factor built into them that accounts for gravity. And even with extract, that still applies. So it's important for brewers to understand that extract, CO2 extract, is not a pre-isomerized product. So that is one question that we sometimes get. We do make pre-isomerized products such as ISO, if there's anybody who's looking to just add something that's already been isomerized, but CO2 extract still requires heating and boiling to become isomerized, which is what's going to yield IBUs. So the principles of efficiency that apply to T90s also apply to CO2 extract. That being said, we do tend to see that CO2 extract tends to be something like 5%, roughly speaking, more efficient than T90s in a kettle situation. So on a standard strength beer, generally speaking, people are going to assume like 30% efficiency on a T90 pellet edition if they're boiling for 60 minutes. We would normally see that be something more like 35% on a CO2 extract edition at 60 minutes on a standard strength beer. That goes down significantly if it's a very strong beer. But anything that any of you guys would like to add to that?
I was just going to say, like, if you do make that recipe the first time using extract, you can adjust that efficiency like Spencer's saying, and then take good notes, and the next time maybe drop that efficiency a little lower if you are making a Imperial IPA. I would just say take good notes and then adjust from there.
Yeah, and one other thing I would add too is that whirlpool efficiencies, I see commonly that craft brewers tend to really underestimate whirlpool efficiencies. Whirlpool editions, particularly full temperature whirlpool editions, so like at boiling, do tend to yield way more IBUs, I think, than most people think. We see them be as high as 20% utilization on a whirlpool edition. So I would, there are a number of labs that offer some pretty economical IBU testing if you don't have the ability to do it in-house. For beers that you make really regularly, I would recommend that you send them in and kind of check your assumptions on IBUs. There's a fair chance that you are getting more than you think you are. But yeah, it's most products, like all products are going to go down in efficiency. All non-pre-isomerized products are going to go down, as the gravity increases in efficiency-wise. But there are products that are slightly more efficient than others. So CO2 extract tends to have a small advantage in that area. So looks like that's all of our questions. If there are any last-minute ones, get them in now. But I would, I guess, just ask the group any last thoughts that we want to add for the brewing world here.
Don't be afraid to use extract across the board, folks. I think it's a really economical, great way to add complexity and efficiency to your products. And thank you for having me on, Spencer.
Yeah.
Yeah, and again, if anyone has any questions, reach out to brewinghelp@yakimachief.com. We'll be happy to walk you guys through a recipe or talk about conversions. Thanks.
Yeah, I would echo the same thing. Don't be afraid. Go forth boldly. Design dynamic recipes and use all the tools that are available to you. It's going to make you a better brewer and hopefully make you more money at the same time. So yeah, and we're here to support. So thanks everybody for attending today. Please attend some of our other Hop and Brew School sessions this week. You can find a full roster of those on virtualharvest.com, and we look forward to seeing you all in person very soon. Thanks.